Far from the battlefields of Europe, odd events were unfolding. Off the shores of Portuguese Goa in India, German U-boats had been annihilating Allied convoys with uncanny precision. This was unlike anything seen before. Allied vessels disappeared within hours of leaving harbor, and the stretch of sea quickly became a death zone, except for one curious exception. Stationary at its center lay a strange, derelict freighter that was far more than it looked like. If the Allies wanted answers, someone would have to board that ship and put an end to it. Those who tried would be disowned by their governments. The mission would officially not exist. When war swept across Europe in September 1939, 3 huge German merchantmen, Arenfels, Braunfeld, and Drainfell, found themselves caught up in the global conflict. Each ship, displacing more than 7,000 tons of steel and cargo, made a frantic run for neutral waters. As Royal Navy hunt groups intensified their patrols, the vessels found sanctuary in Morau Harbor, tucked along the sunlit coast of Portuguese Goa. The ships anchored in the sheltered bay, their engines silenced, while international law afforded them a kind of enforced neutrality. Portugal's delicate diplomatic stance meant these Axis ships could stay indefinitely, but they were as much interned prisoners as they were protected, unable to sail to any other ports. A year later, the Italian freighter Honora staggered into the same harbor, adding a 4th shape to the stranded fleet. Across time, the crews thinned out. Some men took odd jobs in the sultry colonial town. Others scavenged supplies from local markets. To merchant skippers and passing tourists, the 4 hulks looked like nothing more than corroding behemoths, dozing away under the relentless Indian Ocean sun. Yet, beneath that exterior of neglect, something far darker was being built at. First, British naval intelligence wrote off the Goa situation as a nuisance. The immobilized ships did not seem an immediate menace. Unarmed, confined, and operating under the letter of maritime law, the Royal Navy had larger threats to chase: German raiders and new U-boat wolf packs prowling the Atlantic. But by 1942, the strategic picture had changed dramatically. The Indian Ocean had shifted from a sleepy colonial backwater into a vital supply artery. For the Allied war effort, oil flowed from Persian Gulf refineries. Natural rubber left Malaysian plantations, tin came from Burmese mines, and grain sailed from East African ports, all destined for British forces stretched from the western desert to the Burmese front. Major ports, such as Bombay and Karachi, became logistics hubs, their docks jammed with cargo ships and tankers loading supplies for distant campaigns. However, the Royal Navy's escort forces were spread, perilously thin, and could not adequately protect thousands of miles of maritime routes. This exposed weakness was a hunting ground for Axis submarines operating across the Indian Ocean. German U-boats, operating from bases in occupied France and later from Japanese-controlled Penang, began to prey on Allied convoys with chilling accuracy. Torpedoes streaked through moonlit seas, deck guns pummeled crippled merchants, and coordinated wolfpack tactics brought down stragglers. The sinkings ramped up through 1942, often occurring just hours after ships departed port, turning supposedly secure lanes into watery cemeteries. British signals stations scattered across. India began to notice worrying patterns in intercepted traffic. The Special Operations Executive's listening post at Meerut, a nondescript facility ringed by aerials and code machines, detected encoded transmissions originating from within the subcontinent. These were not routine submarine signals, but coordinated reports tied to German U-boat movements. The numbers spoke plainly. Shipping losses around the Indian subcontinent were catastrophically high, far beyond what chance patrols could explain. Someone was supplying the hunters with precise data on convoy routes, cargo loads, and sailing times. Attention turned to the merchantmen anchored in Morau Harbor. The German and Italian ships had been motionless for over 2 years. Yet their placement made them suspect. These maritime apparitions seemed to be functioning as covert radio relays, forming the hub of an intelligence network devastating Allied shipping. By late 1942, intercepted radio traffic hinted at a human link on shore, a courier operating somewhere in neutral Goa, likely passing critical intelligence between the vessels and German submarine command. The trail pointed not to the water, but to the streets of the colonial capital. The investigation led straight to Panaji, Goa's administrative center, where swaying palms shaded Portuguese colonial facades and life moved at a languid tropical tempo. Hidden behind this calm exterior lived Robert Coe, a German whose ordinary appearance concealed a darker occupation. Known as Trumpet to his Gustavo handlers, Coe served as the vital human conduit between Arenfels and U-boat command. Coe and his wife Greta had settled into discreet lives in the neutral colony, keeping modest hours, attending social gatherings, and blending into the expatriate scene. But British intelligence believed Coe was gathering shipping information from a network of sympathizers across British India, then relaying it via a clandestine set aboard Arenfels. The order to remove Coe came from the top of the Special Operations Executive. In November 1942, two veteran officers were tasked with an extraction that would stretch the bounds of international law. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Pugh, an SOE expert in sensitive missions, teamed up with Colonel Valentine Stewart to plan one of the war's boldest abductions. Crossing from British soil into neutral Portuguese Goa demanded meticulous planning and flawless timing. Pugh and Stewart assumed civilian guises with forged papers and practiced backstories. They spent weeks watching the Coe's routines, tracking their movements, and choosing the exact moment to act. On December 19, 1942, the chance arrived. Using an elaborate ruse, the two officers coaxed Robert and Greta Coe out of their home under false pretenses. The seizure was swift, silent, and professional. Under night's cover, they smuggled the couple back across the border into British India, leaving no evidence behind. The Coes were taken to Castle Rock, an isolated railway junction deep in the Western Ghats. The site was ideal for secret questioning, remote, secure, and far from inquisitive eyes. British intelligence officers methodically worked to confirm their suspicions about the Axis spy ring. Under intense interrogation, the full picture started to emerge. Arenfels was more than an abandoned freighter. It was a well-equipped command post with high-powered radio gear. The ship acted as the communication center for a web of pro-Axis agents scattered across the Indian subcontinent, collecting information on Allied sailings and passing it straight to German U-boat command. The spy ring depended on sympathizers embedded in India's ports, shipping firms, and transport networks. These contacts supplied convoy timetables, cargo details, and routing information to Coe, who encoded and transmitted the data via Arenfels' radio. From the ship, radio operators forwarded precise targeting data to prowling U-boats, turning the Indian Ocean into a carefully choreographed kill zone. What became of Robert and Greta Coe after their questioning is unknown. They vanished from official records. No trial, no repatriation, no further entries. Some say they were quietly given new identities, possibly recruited or sheltered by British intelligence. Others fear a darker fate, removed in the name of security. Even after Coe's removal, Arenfels' radio continued to transmit and Allied sinkings kept rising alarmingly. British protests to Goa's Portuguese authorities were ignored. Lisbon's neutrality gave the Germans a robust legal shield. The U-boat offensive in the Indian Ocean reached a climax in early 1943. In the first week of March alone, German submarines sank 12 Allied merchant ships flying the flags of the United States, Britain, Norway, and the Netherlands, losing more than 80,000 tons of vital cargo, enough supplies to sustain whole formations for months. The coordinated manner of these attacks made their source unmistakable. Sophisticated intelligence, perfect timing, and intimate knowledge of Allied shipping. British naval intelligence concluded Arenfels was the keystone of the campaign, the hub that converted random submarine patrols into a unified campaign of devastation. Diplomatic pressure on Portugal continued to fail. Goa's colonial government insisted on strict neutrality and refused to interfere with the interned vessels despite Allied complaints. Faced with mounting losses, the British confronted an impossible choice: accept the ongoing bleed of supplies or violate Portuguese sovereignty and risk diplomatic fallout. The answer demanded an extraordinary solution, an off-the-books operation that would neutralize the threat while preserving plausible deniability. Plans began to take shape for a mission so unlikely it sounded like a scene from a slapstick film. Operation Creek's origin lay in a strange conversation between old acquaintances. In early 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Pugh, the SOE's specialist in impossible tasks, needed volunteers willing to undertake a covert raid with little chance of survival and no hope of official recognition. He rang up Dalgweiss, commander of the Kolkata Light Horse, a volunteer cavalry unit that embodied the amateur spirit of colonial military life. The regiment had a distinguished 185-year history, but by then was better known for social functions and pageantry than combat. Most members were middle-aged expatriates, retired officers and patriotic businessmen who treated service as an adventurous pastime rather than a career. Turning these weekend soldiers into a commando force seemed absurd, but Pugh's choices were limited. Regular troops would attract scrutiny, and professional commandos weren't available for what would amount to a rogue operation. The mission needed men who could pass as civilians yet had enough battlefield experience to handle violent confrontations. Pugh told Grace they required about 15 to 20 volunteers ready to face capture or worse, with no promises of medals, pensions, or public recognition. It was a secret task with no safety net, Grace replied with a dry remark about how attractively Pugh had presented the peril. Despite the risks, Grace agreed to assist. A recruitment meeting was called at once. At that meeting, Grace told the men almost nothing about the specifics. He only said, "I can tell you nothing about it except the operation should take about a fortnight and will involve a short sea voyage. There it is, gentlemen. I leave it to you. Anyone willing to volunteer?" Every hand shot up without hesitation. Selection was fast and pragmatic. Fitness was the chief criterion, and those judged too old, unfit, or overweight were regretfully cut. When one recruit, Bill Manners, fretted that his glass eye might compromise the mission, Grace brushed it off with wry humor. It served Nelson well. "Why not you?" Manners was accepted. The final team numbered 18, mostly from the Kolkata Light Horse, with 4 extra volunteers from the Kolkata Scottish Regiment. They were a cross-section of colonial life: businessmen, planters, clerks, and ex-soldiers, united by a readiness to risk everything for a cause they scarcely understood. Training time was brutally limited. With only days to prepare, the volunteers threw themselves into crash courses on ship-to-ship assaults, demolitions, small unit tactics, and emergency first aid. They studied detailed plans of Arenfels, committing corridors, compartments, and vital systems to memory. Mock exercises simulated boarding under combat conditions, stressing speed, coordination, and improvisation. The plan was deceptively simple and wildly bold. A compact assault team would slip into Morau Harbor aboard an inconspicuous craft, board Arenfels under cover of night, neutralize the crew, wreck the radio transmitter, and slip away before Portuguese authorities could react. To preserve plausible deniability, the raiders would pretend to be drunken pleasure seekers on a joyride, a ludicrous cover that, given the men's appearance, might actually convince onlookers. Success would hinge on perfect timing, flawless execution, and a good measure of luck. Operation Creek was about to turn 18 middle-aged civilians into the most unlikely naval heroes. As the strike force neared the harbor and caught sight of their transport for the first time, uneasy looks passed among the men. Murmurs rippled through the group. "This can't be serious." Their vessel was no warship but HMS Phoebe, a slow, battered hopper barge more familiar with dredging than combat, its sides streaked with rust and its wooden decks creaking. Its shabby, unthreatening appearance made it almost laughable, which is precisely why it was ideal. Commander Bernard Davis, an experienced Royal Navy officer, stood composed at the helm. His quiet assurance was all the men needed. Night draped Goa while nearby Vasco da Gama exploded in carnival revelry. Streets teemed with costumed revelers, masks, music, and laughter. The celebrations provided the perfect cover for the operation's crucial diversion, orchestrated by Jock Cartwright. Using funds from the Special Operations Executive, Cartwright put on an extravagant party in Basco. Free food, endless drink, and professional performers that drew huge crowds, including many of the German and Italian crews from the anchored ships. Arenfels dominated the anchorage, its 7,900-ton bulk casting long shadows across the water as the sun arced overhead. Sailors, starved for excitement after years of idle internment, abandoned their vessels to join the festivities. By 10 p.m., Arenfels was down to a skeleton watch, barely meeting maritime rules and nowhere near enough to repel a determined attack. Even the elements seemed to favor the raiders. Both the harbor lighthouse and the navigation buoy marking the entrance went dark at the same time, plunging the anchorage into complete blackness. The timing could not have been better. At exactly 2:30 a.m., Phoebe's engines coughed and strained as the slow barge surged forward. Commander Davis gripped the wheel, eyes fixed, and the hulking outline of Arenfels loomed ahead. Inch by inch, Phoebe lurched closer, its battered bow aimed like a ram. With a thunderous impact, steel met steel. Metal shrieked and buckled as the barge smashed into Arenfels' starboard side. The crash signaled the assault. 18 British volunteers, armed with Sten guns, Mills bombs, and demolition charges, swarmed over Phoebe's bow onto Arenfels' deck. The German watch, taken utterly by surprise, poured from their bunks in varying states of dress, bewildered and scrambling to understand the chaos. The ship erupted into pandemonium. Muzzle flashes stuttered through the night as automatic fire cracked, the staccato rattle carrying over the water. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Pugh led the assault down the ship's narrow, twisting passages, his men moving with clinical efficiency. Faint emergency lights threw long shadows as they cleared each compartment, crushing resistance without pause. Their objective lay deep inside the superstructure, the radio room, the pulsating core of the German espionage network. After savage close-quarters fighting, they reached the communications center, a jungle of transmitters, coding machines, and piled secret documents. The raiders ripped through the apparatus, smashing equipment without mercy. With codebooks already alight, they set charges beneath benches and behind key wiring, then sprinted for the exits, boots clanging on steel as they raced down the corridor. Moments later, a violent explosion shook the ship. The radio room was consumed by fire and flying metal. Invaluable transmitters and decoding machines were destroyed, and the U-boat network was suddenly and permanently deaf. Arenfels' crew fought desperately, but several men, including the captain, did not survive the onslaught, their last stand ending amid gunfire and flame. As the fighting on Arenfels continued, alarm spread to the other Axis ships moored nearby. Drainfeld, Braunfeld, and Honora erupted into frantic activity as their crews grasped the situation's severity. Rather than allow their vessels to be captured, they chose to scuttle them, smashing seacocks, breaking valves, and flooding holds to deny the enemy any prize. Water gushed into the ship's bilges with the roar of surf. The hulks listed and began to sink. Sailors abandoned burning decks, plunging into the Black Sea and struggling toward shore, only to be taken into Portuguese custody and held in local jails. Arenfels, too, was doomed as surviving Germans followed their shipmates' example, flooding engine rooms and holds. The great freighter lurched over, its superstructure rising at alarming angles as the water swallowed it. British raiders worked feverishly to evacuate before the vessel became a tomb, cutting mooring lines, collecting intelligence material, and shepherding prisoners toward Phoebe, which stayed lashed to Arenfels' side. Commander Davis showed masterful seamanship, wringing every bit of power from Phoebe to break away from the sinking giant. A terse radio message sliced the night. Longshanks. That single code word confirmed Operation Creek had achieved its aim. The Axis intelligence network in the Indian Ocean had been shattered, its ships destroyed and its personnel either captured or neutralized. Portuguese officials reacted with the expected mixture of confusion and indignation. Local papers ran stories suggesting mutiny aboard the German ships, and the courts in Morau eventually framed the episode as deliberate scuttling. On October 1, 1943, surviving seamen were convicted of sinking their own vessels and sentenced to imprisonment until the war's end, an outcome that conveniently preserved Portuguese neutrality. The immediate effect of Operation Creek was clear and measurable. For the remainder of March, 13 U-boats operating in the Indian Ocean sank only a single Allied merchant ship. April's losses rose to 3 vessels, still a tiny fraction of the earlier carnage. Destroying Arenfels' radio setup had effectively blinded the submarine force, turning coordinated hunters into haphazard predators reliant on chance. Despite its strategic significance, Operation Creek stayed buried in official secrecy. The volunteer raiders received no medals, no public praise, and no formal acknowledgement. They created their own symbol, a seahorse emblem, to mark their contribution to the war. The Kolkata Light Horse and Kolkata Scottish were disbanded after Indian independence in 1947, their members scattering across the post-colonial world. The full story remained classified until 1974, when declassified British files finally revealed what had happened that March night in Morau Harbor. In 1951, the Port Trust salvaged the 4 wrecks with help from a German expatriate who had stayed in Goa after the war. And decades later, plans were made to scrap what remained of the hulks that once menaced Allied convoys. The wider public first learned of Operation Creek in 1978 when journalist James Leeser published the tale. It was later filmed in 1980 as The Sea Wolves, starring Gregory Peck, Roger Moore, and David Niven, Hollywood's salute to an improbable band of naval heroes. Documents released in 2002 added intriguing epilogues. 3 Axis sailors who surrendered in the raid later collaborated with SOE units across India before returning home. A striking turnaround from foes to operatives. The files also showed that the British had hoped to seize the ships intact. But rapid scuttling by their crews made that impossible, long neglected. Operation Creek ultimately proved that a band of aging patriots, masquerading as drunken pleasure seekers on a bogus cruise, could pull off one of the war's most extraordinary raids. They never sought medals or headlines, but their success deserved celebration. As Alistair Redmayne McFarland of the Kolkata Light Horse put it, to drink to deeds of daring, and the men had every right to raise a glass.